Picture Mount Sinai. You already know what you're seeing. A rocky peak in Egypt's Sinai Peninsula. Pilgrims climbing stone steps in the dark, torches in hand, racing the sunrise to the summit. At the base, St. Catherine's Monastery. Ancient, serene, one of the oldest continuously operating monasteries in the world. For 1,500 years, this mountain has been the answer, the place where Moses stood, the place where God spoke, the place where the 10 Commandments came down. Now forget all of it. That mountain, the one on every Bible map, the one 1 million tourists have climbed, the one the Byzantine Empire decided was holy in the 6th century, isn't Mount Sinai. The tradition is wrong. No historical record connects that peak to Moses before 300 AD. Not one Jewish source, not one early Christian source. 15 centuries of pilgrimage, built on silence, and the Bible, the actual text, has been pointing somewhere else the entire time. So here is the question driving everything that follows. If the most visited holy site in the world is the wrong mountain, where is the right one? What does the Bible actually say? What does the archaeology show? And what changes when you move the mountain to where the evidence says it belongs? Let's investigate. 2 worlds sit on either side of a narrow strip of water called the Gulf of Aqaba. On the west, the Sinai Peninsula, a triangle of Egyptian desert roughly the size of Ireland. Rocky, dry, Egyptian military garrisons in the north, turquoise mines in the south, trade routes through the middle. This is the world most Bible maps place Israel in after the Exodus. On the east, the land of Midian, northwestern Saudi Arabia, a volcanic mountain range rising from the Red Sea coast, jagged peaks, black stone, a wilderness so remote it barely appears in ancient records. No garrisons, no mines, no reason for Egypt to care about it at all. These 2 worlds are separated, at their closest point, by 11 miles of water. Where Israel crossed determines everything, the route, the mountain, and where Moses spent 40 years of his life before he ever set foot in Egypt to face Pharaoh. That last detail is the one most people miss entirely. Moses did not come to Mount Sinai as a stranger. He came home. Exodus 2:15. After fleeing Egypt, Moses runs, not into the Sinai Peninsula, but to Midian. He sat at a well. He met a priest named Jethro. He married Jethro's daughter. He tended flocks for 40 years in that land, and it was in the wilderness near Midian that he came to a mountain, the mountain, and saw a bush that burned without being consumed. The burning bush didn't happen on the Sinai Peninsula. It happened in Midian. Exodus 3:1 states it plainly. Moses led his flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. Horeb and Sinai are 2 names for the same mountain. Every major biblical commentary agrees on this, and the first time that mountain appears in the text, it is placed in Midian. The ancient city of Madian, the capital of Midian, survives today as the Saudi Arabian town of Al-Bad. The name is still on modern maps. Jewish, Christian, and Islamic sources across 2,000 years consistently locate Midian on the eastern shore of the Gulf of Aqaba, in what is now northwestern Saudi Arabia. Midian was never in Egypt. It was never on the Sinai Peninsula. It was always across the water. The Bible has been saying this from the first page of Exodus. We just kept drawing the maps wrong. Here's the detail most people never think to ask. When was Jabal Musa first identified as the Mountain of Moses? Not in the early church, not in the writings of the apostles, not in any Jewish text from the centuries after the Exodus. The earliest connection between that Egyptian peak and Mount Sinai appears in the writings of the church historian Eusebius. Around 300 AD, roughly 1,700 years after Moses stood on the real mountain. For context, imagine someone in the ruins of Rome, 1,700 years after Julius Caesar, pointing at a random hill and saying, "That is where Caesar was born." No records, no unbroken tradition, just a claim made in a world where the original knowledge had long since dissolved into legend. That is what happened with Jabal Musa. In the early 4th century, the Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity and brought the empire with him. His mother, Helena, undertook a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. She found Golgotha, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the nativity site in Bethlehem. She had the authority to build monuments on whatever she identified as holy. She also had no way of verifying any of them. In the Sinai Peninsula, desert monks had already settled the region. One of them claimed a particular mountain was the site of the burning bush. A monk said so. Not a document nor a scripture reference, just a monk in the desert who pointed at a bush. Emperor Justinian built a monastery around it in 527 AD. The mountain beside it became Mount Sinai. The tradition was set in stone, literally in the walls of the building, and 15 centuries of pilgrimage followed. Nobody questioned the starting point. Exhaustive archaeological surveys of the southern Sinai Peninsula have found no physical evidence of a large Israelite encampment during the period of the Exodus. Not a single piece of pottery, not a campfire, not a burial, not a tool or a coin from the relevant period. And more striking, no Jewish pilgrim ever came here before the Christian monastic movement began. No rabbinic text, no inscription, no documentary evidence of Jewish veneration at Jabal Musa before the monks arrived. The tradition and the tourism arrived together. Compare that to what Paul wrote in Galatians in the 1st century AD, within living memory of people who would have known. He doesn't point to Egypt. He doesn't reference a monastery or a tradition of veneration. He states it as settled geographical fact. Mount Sinai is in Arabia. Paul was a Pharisee trained in Jerusalem by the greatest scholar of his generation. He spent 3 years in Arabia after his conversion, by his own account in Galatians 1:17. He wrote as a man who had been there. The tradition everyone trusts was built 15 centuries after the event, on the testimony of desert monks in a region that has yielded no physical evidence of the Exodus at all. That is not a foundation. That is a guess that became a monument. About this debate, you don't need archaeology to make the case. You don't need satellite imagery or volcanic geology or underwater land bridges. You just need to read the Bible. Slowly, in order, without skipping the geography. Exodus 2:15, Moses runs from Egypt. The text is specific. He fled to Midian, the land on the eastern shore of the Gulf of Aqaba, in what is now northwestern Saudi Arabia. He sat at a well. He met Jethro. He married Jethro's daughter. He built a life there, 40 years. When Israel followed Moses out of Egypt and into the desert, he was not navigating by faith alone. He already knew the way. Exodus 3:1. Moses leads Jethro's flocks to the far side of the wilderness and comes to Horeb, the mountain of God, the burning bush, the commissioning, the moment God reveals his name as I am. All of it happens in Midian, on a mountain Moses had almost certainly walked near before, in 40 years of shepherding that same wilderness. But the text goes further. In Exodus 18, while Israel is camped at the mountain of God, Jethro comes to visit. He travels from Midian to the mountain. He advises Moses on governing the people. Then, Exodus 18:27, Jethro departs and goes back to his own land. Back to Midian, from the mountain. Jethro travels from Midian to the mountain, then from the mountain back to Midian. The text implies distance. The mountain is near Midian, but not inside it. In the wilderness adjacent to Midian. On its edge, which fits precisely with a mountain in the volcanic range of northwestern Saudi Arabia. Now turn to the New Testament, Galatians 4:25. Read it slowly. Paul writes, Mount Sinai is in Arabia. 3 words, no ambiguity, no hedging, no qualification. Paul was not guessing. He was educated in Jerusalem by Gamaliel, the most respected rabbi of his generation. He spent 3 years in Arabia after his conversion. When Paul writes that Mount Sinai is in Arabia, he writes as a man who has been there. And the Arabia of Paul's world was not the Sinai Peninsula. In the 1st century, Arabia referred to the territory east of the Jordan River and south of Damascus, the land of the Nabateans, the Ishmaelites, the Midianites, the eastern shore of the Gulf of Aqaba, what is now Saudi Arabia and Jordan. The Sinai Peninsula was not Arabia in Paul's geography, it was Egypt. Now add the sources outside the Bible. Josephus, the 1st century Jewish historian, describes Mount Sinai as the highest mountain in its region. He locates it in Arabia. He describes Moses traveling to it from Midian. Eusebius, the 4th century church historian who first connects the peninsula to the tradition, also records in his geographical dictionary, the Onomasticon, that Midian was located near the town of Madian on the eastern shore of the Gulf of Aqaba. He places Midian in Arabia. In the same document where he begins to associate Sinai with the peninsula, he simultaneously locates Midian across the water from it. He contradicts himself, and nobody noticed for 16 centuries. The Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures, the Bible of the New Testament world, consistently places Midian in northwestern Saudi Arabia. The translators closest in time to the original events never pointed at Egypt. Every ancient witness says the same thing. Midian was in Arabia. The mountain was in Midian. Therefore, the mountain was in Arabia. Paul wasn't offering a theological metaphor in Galatians 4:25. He was stating a geographical fact so obvious to his 1st century readers that he needed no explanation. God didn't leave a monastery. He left a text. Here's the problem nobody can solve if Sinai is in Egypt. The route doesn't work. Not logistically, not militarily, not geographically. Start with the distance. From Goshen, where Israel lived in Egypt's eastern Nile Delta, to Jabal Musa at the southern tip of the Sinai Peninsula is approximately 350 miles. On foot, through sand and broken rock, in the heat of a Near Eastern summer, with 2 million people, with children, with flocks and herds. Exodus 19:1. Israel arrives at the wilderness of Sinai in the 3rd month after leaving Egypt. That is a march of roughly 4 miles per day, every day, without rest. For a military unit traveling light, that is demanding. For 2 million people with children and livestock, it is essentially impossible. But the distance is not the worst problem. The route south through the Sinai Peninsula was not empty wilderness. The Egyptians knew it intimately. Along the northern coast, Egypt maintained permanent military fortifications. Exodus 13:17 records that God redirected Israel away from that northern route, specifically because they might face war and turn back. So Israel turned south, but the southern Sinai was not unguarded either. Egyptian turquoise mines operated at Serabit el-Qadim in the southwestern peninsula, worked by Egyptian expeditions of hundreds of soldiers and miners in precisely the period of the Exodus. A column of 2 million escaped slaves marching south would have walked directly into the operational zone of the army already pursuing them from behind. The Egyptians were already there. The text gives no account of Israel fighting or avoiding Egyptian mining garrisons, because on the route the text actually describes, they did not encounter them, because Israel did not go south through the peninsula. Now look at the alternative. The Gulf of Aqaba is the eastern branch of the Red Sea. At its southern end, between the tip of the Sinai Peninsula and the Saudi coast, lies the Strait of Tirane. Beneath its surface, at roughly 50 feet depth, runs an underwater land bridge, a natural shelf of rock and coral flanked on both sides by water dropping to several thousand feet. deep enough to drown an army. The Red Sea crossing in Exodus describes walls of water on both sides, a dry path through the sea, and an Egyptian army swallowed entirely. The Gulf of Suez at its proposed crossing points is between 3 and 30 feet deep. At the Strait of Tiran, the water beside the land bridge drops to several thousand feet. Walls of water. On both sides. Egypt swallowed. The geography fits. Once Israel crosses at the Strait of Tiran, 11 miles east, they are on the Arabian coast. In Midian, where Moses spent 40 years, where the burning bush appeared, where the mountain was waiting. One final piece from the text itself. Deuteronomy 1:2. Moses says in passing, "It is 11 days' journey from Horeb to Kadesh Barnea by the way of Mount Seir. Measure 11 days' march from Kadesh Barnea at 20 to 25 miles per day for a large group, and you land not at Jabal Musa in the southern Sinai Peninsula. You land in northwestern Saudi Arabia, at a cluster of volcanic mountains near the ancient city of Midian, at a mountain whose peak is blackened." The text placed the mountain in Arabia. Paul placed the mountain in Arabia. The root placed the mountain in Arabia. The mountain has been there the whole time, waiting for someone to ask the right question. Here's what surprises most people when they see it for the first time. The mountain doesn't look like every other mountain. Jabal Makla sits in the Midian range of northwestern Saudi Arabia, roughly 20 kilometers south of the ancient city of Al-Bad, the biblical Midian. It rises to approximately 2,500 meters. From a distance, it looks unremarkable. Brown rock, desert scrub, until you look at the summit. The top of Jabal Makla is black, not dark brown, not shadowed granite. Black, a scorched, glazed blackness covering the upper portion of the mountain, stopping at a clear boundary below which the rock returns to natural reddish-brown. Researchers who have reached the summit and broken off samples found normal brown granite on the inside. The blackening is a surface phenomenon. Something happened to the exterior of this one mountain that did not happen to any of the surrounding peaks. Every other peak around it is brown. This one is burned. Exodus 19:18. The Lord descended upon Mount Sinai in fire. The whole mountain trembled violently. Smoke billowed up like smoke from a furnace. That is not a coincidence waiting to be explained away. Now look at what sits at the base of the mountain. Researchers, some of them entering illegally before Saudi Arabia's 2019 opening, some of them since, have documented a large altar of stacked boulders at the foot of Jabal Makla. Not a natural rock formation, a deliberately constructed structure consistent with ancient Near Eastern altar construction. And on the stones of that altar, carvings, petroglyphs of cattle, not the wild animals of the Arabian Peninsula. Cattle depicted in a style consistent with the Egyptian Apis bull, the sacred animal of Egyptian religious iconography, the bull that represented divine power in the Egypt Israel had just escaped. Egyptian, not Arabian. Exodus 32. While Moses is on the summit, the people grow impatient. They go to Aaron. They say, "Make us gods." Aaron fashions their gold earrings into the shape of a calf. He builds an altar before it. Israel worships the golden calf. At the foot of the real mountain, carved into the stones of a real altar, are the images of Egyptian bulls. The people who had just left Egypt, who knew the shape of the Apis bull from childhood, carved that shape into the altar stones they built while Moses was gone. The evidence and the text arrive at the same place. Now walk a short distance from that altar. Near the base of Jabal Makla stands a massive boulder, roughly 18 meters high, split vertically down the center. The split is clean, precise, as though divided by a single decisive force rather than gradual geological fracturing. But it is not the split that stops researchers cold. It is what surrounds the base of the rock. Erosion channels, running outward from the split in multiple directions across the valley floor, smooth channels carved into the granite, consistent with the sustained flow of a significant volume of water over time. In a desert that receives almost no annual rainfall, the channels are not there because of rain. There is not enough rain. They are there because, at some point, a large quantity of water emerged from that rock and ran outward across the valley simultaneously. Exodus 17:6. Strike the rock at Horeb. Water will come out of it. The people will drink. Now stand back and look at all of it together. A blackened summit in a region the Bible places the mountain. A large altar at its base with Egyptian bull imagery at the site where Exodus records the golden calf. A split rock with erosion channels at the site where Exodus records water from the rock. 3 pieces of physical evidence, 3 corresponding passages, all at the same location. Here is what the broader archaeological record adds without excavating the mountain at all. In the 12th century BC, the period scholars associate with the wilderness wandering, a distinctive style of painted pottery appears across the ancient Near East. Scholars call it Midianite ware. Its origin is northwestern Saudi Arabia. It has been found in the Negev in Jordan at an Egyptian temple at Timnah, but not in the Sinai Peninsula. The material culture of Midian points away from the traditional Sinai. In the period that matters, consistently, across multiple excavation sites, and the mountain itself has never been professionally excavated. Frank Moore Cross, Harvard University Dead Sea Scrolls scholar, one of the giants of 20th century biblical archaeology, requested permission to excavate Jabal Makla with the American Schools of Oriental Research. He was not allowed. The mountain sits behind a fence. Military reservation, restricted access. The most important archaeological question of our generation may be under 3 feet of Saudi Arabian desert, and nobody has been allowed to dig. What sits on the surface, visible, photographable, documentable without a single shovel, already matches the biblical text in ways the traditional site does not. God chose the most remote mountain he could find. It was still leaving evidence. Stand in the valley. It is the 3rd month after the Exodus from Egypt. The desert air is cool before dawn, dry and mineral, carrying the faint smell of dust and wood smoke from 2 million cooking fires that have burned through the night. The valley floor stretches in every direction, flat, wide, ringed by mountains on 3 sides, a natural amphitheater carved into the wilderness of northwestern Saudi Arabia, broad enough to hold an encampment of staggering size. And it is full. Tents as far as the eye can reach. Livestock pens. Children asleep. The old and the young and everyone between. The former slaves of Egypt. The people who walked through a parted sea 6 weeks ago and are still not sure what they are now. Not slaves, not soldiers, not yet a nation. A people suspended between what they escaped and what they were promised. They have been camped here for days, and Moses has not come back down. He went up 40 days ago, into the cloud that settled on the summit and did not lift. Some of them watched it every morning when they woke. Some of them stopped watching. The waiting has its own weight. 40 days is a long time to stand at the base of a mountain and not know what is happening above you. The children ask. The elders have no answer. And then, before the sun clears the eastern ridge, the mountain moves. Not metaphorically, not in the imagination of a frightened people, the mountain moves. Exodus 19:16. Thunder, not rolling toward them from the distance but overhead, immediate, filling the valley from wall to wall. Lightning fracturing the sky above the summit, a cloud so thick it presses down onto the peak like a lid. And then, cutting through all of it, a sound the text describes as a trumpet blast. Growing louder, not fading as a trumpet fades. Growing, every person in the camp trembles. Exodus 19:18. The whole mountain is covered in smoke. because the Lord descended on it in fire. The summit of Jabal Makla, the mountain that sits in the Midian range of northwestern Saudi Arabia, whose peak is still blackened today, that Paul placed in Arabia and the text placed in Midian. That summit is on fire. Not burning brush, not a lightning strike catching scrub. The mountain is on fire. The smoke billows upward like smoke from a furnace. The whole mountain shakes violently. The trumpet grows louder and louder until it is the only sound in the valley, and there is nowhere in the world at this moment that matters except this valley and this mountain and the fire coming down onto its summit. The people fall back. Exodus 20:18. They see the thunder and the lightning and the sound of the trumpet and the mountain in smoke. And they tremble, and they stand far off, and they say to Moses, "You speak to us, and we will listen, but do not let God speak to us, or we will die." They are not being dramatic, they are being accurate. This is what holiness looks like when it arrives without filtration, without a veil, without a priest standing between the people and the presence, just fire and smoke, and a sound that shakes the ground, and a mountain burning at its summit, and a people who suddenly, completely, understand the distance between what they are and what God is. They have been in the presence of God for 6 weeks. The pillar of cloud, the pillar of fire, the manna each morning. None of it prepared them for this. Nothing prepares you for this. And above them, on the summit still black today, on the peak no archaeologist has yet excavated, on the mountain that 3,000 years of misdirection placed in Egypt and the Bible quietly, consistently placed in Arabia, Moses stands, alone, in the fire and the smoke and the sound, his feet on the same rock that a burning bush set alight 40 years earlier, a few miles from his father-in-law's house. In the wilderness, he walked for 4 decades before anyone knew his name. He came to this mountain as a fugitive, a murderer, a man hiding in the only place on earth Pharaoh would not follow. He came back as the leader of 2 million people and the instrument of the most audacious liberation in human history. And now he stands on its summit while the voice of God speaks words that will govern human civilization for the next 3,000 years. Not in Jerusalem, not in Rome, not in a cathedral or a monastery or a site marked on a pilgrimage map. Here, in the volcanic wilderness of northwestern Saudi Arabia, on a blackened mountain that sits behind a chain-link fence, in a country that for most of history did not permit foreigners to enter, on a summit that still carries the evidence of what happened on it. If you know where to look, we started with the wrong mountain, a peak in Egypt chosen by a Byzantine empress, consecrated by a 6th century monastery, venerated by 15 centuries of pilgrims who climbed its stone steps in the dark and believed, genuinely, devoutly, with everything in them, that they were standing where Moses stood. That devotion was real. The location may not have been. St. Catherine's Monastery was founded in 527 AD. Moses stood on the mountain of God approximately 1446 BC. Nearly 2,000 years separated the event from the tradition that claimed to mark it. 2,000 years in which no Jewish pilgrim, no early Christian writer, no unbroken chain of testimony connected that Egyptian peak to the Exodus. 2,000 years in which the evidence, the text, the root, the scholars, the surface archaeology was quietly pointing somewhere else. The people who climbed Jabal Musa in the dark were not foolish. They were doing what human beings have always done, seeking the place where heaven touched earth, seeking something physical to hold on to in a faith that traffics in the invisible. That is not nothing, but here is what the evidence asks us to consider. The real mountain. If the text is right, if Paul is right, if the root and the blackened summit and the altar petroglyphs and the split rock are right, spent 3,000 years in one of the most inaccessible places on earth, behind a fence, in a military zone, in a country closed to foreigners for most of modern history, unknown to pilgrims, unvisited by scholars, unexcavated by anyone. Because God chose that mountain before any of this happened, He chose a mountain so remote that Moses only found it because he spent 40 years living nearby. A mountain that would one day sit behind a chain-link fence in a country that would make it nearly impossible to reach. A mountain that would spend 3 millennia outside the awareness of the faith traditions that should have been looking for it. He chose the place nobody would think to look. That has always been His method. A burning bush in the backside of a desert, a baby in a feeding trough in a town nobody came from, a carpenter's son from Galilee with no army, no palace, no institutional authority, a borrowed tomb in a garden. God has always done His most important work in the places nobody was looking. The mountain of the law, where the covenant was spoken, where the fire came down, where a former slave stood in smoke and received the words that would govern human civilization, was never in a monastery, never on a pilgrimage route, never on a tourist map. It was in the wilderness where Moses hid, in the land where he built his life before anyone knew his name. On a peak that still carries the scorch marks of the night, the voice of God shook it to its foundations, waiting, silent. Behind a fence in northwestern Saudi Arabia, the Bible knew where it was the entire time. We just stopped reading the geography. And here is the question I want to leave with you. The blackened summit of Jabal Makalla, the Apis bull petroglyphs carved into the altar stones at its base. Paul's letter to the Galatians, written in the 1st century, placing the mountain in Arabia without hesitation or qualification. Which piece of evidence hit you hardest? And if the fence came down tomorrow and the excavation finally began, what do you think they would find? Tell me below.